Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. This is game number 36, and in this series we are going through the book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we are looking at the second game of Geza Marcozy, and he has the white pieces, and his opponent is Max Euwe, who isn't yet world champion but will be soon in the future. Now Maroczy plays e4, and we see c5 going into the Sicilian defense. Now we see knight f3, the most critical variation, knight c6, and d4. So c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6. So this is the open Sicilian, when you play d4 and basically open up the board a bit. Now here we see knight f6, and Reti comments that this is one of the more common moves and one of the more critical ones, because black is immediately putting pressure on this e4 pawn, forcing white to respond with knight c3, because otherwise they could play c4. And the thing about the Sicilian is that black will often have slightly slower development, because once these knights are developed, they haven't really got any easy, quick developing moves they can make, except for maybe queen to c7. However, black has traded off a c pawn for a d pawn, so has a central pawn majority, which they may be able to use to their advantage in the future, and is likely going to be a little bit better in an endgame. And black also has the open c file, which they can apply quite a bit of pressure on. And the issue is, if black allows white to play c4 and have a pawn on c4 and e4, then white will have a very clear space advantage, very clear central control, which will mean that black's central pawn majority will be a bit harder to mobilize and a bit harder to utilize. And actually, trying to think what will make it possible. Well, let's just say this pawn isn't hanging and we're able to play c4 here. So let's say we get into this position somehow. It's not a great variation for this, but this pawn setup with a pawn on c4 and a pawn on e4 is actually called the Maroczy bind, which is named after Maroczy, who we're seeing playing now. I believe he played it first against someone in around the 1920s. So that's why knight f6 is played here, to attack this pawn and force knight to c3. Now next we see d6. Reti comments that in the past e6 used to be quite a common move, hoping to try and push d5. However, black will often end up with a isolated queen's pawn, an isolated d pawn, and the position will be fairly open, and white will be able to take advantage of this isolated pawn a lot more than black can. But instead he says that knight to b5 here is perhaps better. When after bishop to b4, he says that knight to d6 followed by king to e7 just means that white's attack has just completely disappeared and black is able to continue developing and has the advantage. However, after bishop to b4, he actually gives a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, then d5. After ed, bishop to d3, castles. Reti comments that white would have a fairly good game here. The computer evaluates this as being fairly equal, but white would be perhaps the one who is easier to win, easier to play in practice. Now, interestingly, Reti actually calls this the Sheveningen, but this isn't really the way it's played these days. It's more in line with the timer knob, if anything. So that's the variation which Reti gives as e6. Now, actually, after e6 is what we would now call the four knights defense. Sorry, the four knights variation. He also says that. Sorry, no, I was looking at g6, but that's not played just yet. He also says that an alternative to this knight f6 may be a6, which can potentially transpose into like the Khan, Sicilian, or Taimanov, but c4 is a potentially dangerous option. Well, it's also going to like the Maroczy, the O'Kelly formation as well. However, we see knight f6 and then knight to c3. And now we have bishop to, d6, and then we have bishop to e2 and e6. And now this is what we know today as being the Sheveningen, if that's pronounced right, with knights on c6, f6, and the pawns on e6 and d6. Now Reti comments that instead of e6, we could have seen g6, which would transpose into a dragon Sicilian, and we've seen a game like this already, I think. But instead we see e6, and then castles, bishop to e7, and now king to h1. Now Reti says that Maroczy very often played the Sicilian himself, so he knew how to navigate it positionally. Now at the time it was very common for black to want to try and get a knight to this c4 square. And because of that, knight to e5 was an option, or knight to a5. Whether the knight will actually jump into c4 is questionable, but it would certainly provide some pressure to c4, especially after b5 is played. And so Maroczy plays king h1 because he's hoping to push f4 to prevent this knight jump, and he doesn't want f4 to be met with a check. Now here we see castles, f4, preventing knight to e5. We see queen to c7, and now knight to b3, which prevents knight to a5. We see a6, intending potentially b5, but Maroczy plays a4, and now Reti comments that white has managed to limit how much positional pressure black is able to put on the position, or black is able to put on the queen side specifically. He says that white's pieces are more actively placed and a lot more active than black's pieces, and white is currently making b5 a very difficult move to try to play. He says that perhaps instead of black castling, he should have played knight e5 straight away, because then white wouldn't be able to prevent. Sorry, instead of castling, black should have played a6 straight away, and in this position white wouldn't be able to prevent both knight e5 and b5. However, it's a bit late for that now. White has stopped b5 and has stopped knight e5. So we see b6 instead, hoping to make some room for the bishop, and this is almost like a hedgehog style structure. Now here we have bishop to f3, bishop to b7, bishop to e3, and now knight to b4. So black is uncovering this light square bishop, and also is hoping to push d5. So you see how everything is lining up against this d5 square because black wants to get a d5 push in. However, Reti comments that d5 often isn't a very good move in the Sicilian, but other openings as well, if d5 can be met with e5, since after e5 white would have a potentially dominant and promising kingside attack, and black would have difficulty trying to get some counterplay on the queen side. Now here we see queen to e2, d5 anyway, e5. Reti says that knight d7 probably should have been played here, but he doesn't actually give a reason. But instead we see knight to e4. You see bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and now queen to f2, doubling up against this b6 pawn. And it's not too clear how black can really defend this pawn without there being some degree of awkwardness. Bishop to d8 double up is just again awkward, and the move which black plays in the game is b5. And the idea is that if white captures twice, then they would hang the c2 pawn. So he pushes b5, essentially, whilst not tactically defending the pawn, being able to tactically remain equal in material. So we see a takes b5, a takes b5, and now knight to d4. Now here we see bishop to c6, queen to g3, and Reti comments that with this move sort of illustrates white's potential attacking chances on the king side. White now is threatening something like f5 and f6, and if they're able to get in this pawn pushes, then white will have a fairly devastating attack. So black responds to this by first taking on a1, and then rook to b8. So black's hoping to try and free up this f8 square for the bishop, where it can add a defense to g7, and also hoping to cover the b pawn, which was attacked twice, but only defended once. Now here we see f5 anyway, e takes f5, knight takes f5, and now bishop to f8. Obviously mate was being threatened, so the bishop defends against mate. Then we see bishop to f4, lining up against the queen, making a potential pawn push really quite a powerful threat. Here we see rook to a8, and now rook to c1, and Reti praises this move quite a lot. He says that it is a very well considered winning move, since black can't really defend against the threat of e6 followed by e7, since the queen can't really leave c7 without the potential sacrifice on g7 being quite decisive. The queen would have to be able to come to the defense. And the idea is, after knight takes, bishop h6 can come. So he also comments that rook takes a8 is perhaps an inferior move, although this is actually the computer's move, but bishop takes a8 is the continuation given by Reti, followed by e6, and queen a7 is given. And this is now winning for white. The only move that seems to work in the computer's eyes is queen to c4. So after e takes, we can have queen take. Oh, sorry, not queen takes. We have king to h8. And this is the only way which the computer finds can really hold. But instead, Reti gives queen to a7 in this variation. And then after bishop a3, attacking the queen, queen to a1 check. Oh, sorry, yes. This is the variation given by Reti. I think the idea is that knight going to here is a potential threat, as well as this pawn coming up here. He's just threatening to queen this pawn. However, the computer again does find some form of defense. After bishop e3, queen a1, bishop to g1, then f takes g6, knight to h6 check is the variation given by Reti. King h8 followed by queen to f4. And it's not too clear how black is really able to actually respond to these threats, because obviously mate is currently being threatened. And they haven't really got a good way to respond to it at all. In fact, the computer just gives queen takes g1 check. Now, if you were to move this bishop out of the way, let's say to e7, then you would still be mated with queen b8. So he says that rook takes a8 is an inferior move, because after bishop takes a8, e6, queen to a7, and black has no real defense against the threats that white has. Although queen to c4 is perhaps holdable, but it's the only move in the position. So understandable that no one saw it. He also says that rook to f1 is a potential alternative. However, after knight to d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, e6, queen to c4, things still aren't that clear for white, and the white's advantages sort of diminish quite a bit. So he says that rook to c1 is the best move in a position, because black can't really defend against the threat of pushing e6 followed by e7, and a potential knight sacrifice on g7 followed by bishop h6. Now in the game we see g6 being played, hoping to try and defend against any threats along the g-file. e6 attacking the queen, queen to b7, and now e7 comes. So in the game we see bishop to g7. It's worth noting that bishop takes e7 is met with knight takes e7, queen takes e7, followed by bishop to d6, which forks a knight and the queen, and a piece is going to be lost. So bishop takes e7 wasn't played. It's actually the computer's best move. The computer obviously thinks that just sacrificing a piece is the only way that black can actually survive. But we see bishop to g7, logically. Knight takes g7, king takes g7, and now queen to h4, defending the pawn. f6, stopping the queen attacking the pawn. However, this queen h4 move had another threat, which was queen h6 check. And after king to g8 and bishop to d6, black resigned. And they resigned because this knight is under attack, and you've got the pawn, the queen, and the bishop all attacking this f8 square. So no matter what, white's very likely to get the queen or win a lot of material. Let's say you try and block the pawn with the rook. Well, queen f8 is going to come, and then you're forced to take, and that's mate. If instead you just simply try to move the knight out of the way, then again queen f8 will come. And it's very difficult for black to be able to defend against this threat. The only real way is probably something like queen to c8, but even then bishop takes b4, and you've still got the potential queening motives by trying to play here, or if you can just try and queen it and just get a full queen for nothing, and you're just down a piece. So that's why in this position, after bishop to d6, forking a knight and this f8 square, black resigned. And so that's game number 36. I believe it's probably the last game of Maroczy that we're going to see in the book. And it's the second Sicilian defence we've seen. and surprisingly against a future world champion, Max Euwe. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.